is Senator Johnson, followed by Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McGuineas, you mentioned Simpson-Bowles. I just want to, for the record, make sure everybody understands we've actually done about 81% of Simpson-Bowles. Simpson-Bowles asked for about $1 trillion in tax increases. In our fiscal cliff deal, we got about $700 billion. They're looking for about $1.9 trillion in discretionary spending reductions. In our Budget Control Act, we got about 2.1. Then Simpson-Bowles also had about $500 billion of some mandatory spending, which we haven't done. So Simpson-Bowles, before interest, was looking for about $3.4 trillion of deficit reduction. We've done about 2.8. Now, it's been a pretty messy process, but lest anybody think that's a panacea. I mean, it certainly has helped in the short term, but we've got a long-term problem, which I want to talk about. I've certainly been trying to point out that we don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We really have a 30-year demographic problem. We have all the baby boom generation. We're a retirement rate of 10,000 per day. We made all these promises, and we really don't know how to pay for them. So if you look at and I see in your testimony, Ms. McGuineas, you talked about the CBO's ultimate fiscal scenario. So we've actually converted those percentage GDP, which nobody understands, to dollars. Let me just run it by you. In the first decade, the deficit is projected, according to CBO's ultimate fiscal scenario, to be $8 trillion. The second decade, $31 trillion. The third decade, $88 trillion. I always like to point out that my little baby girl just turned 31, and that kind of went by like that. Now, net private asset base of America is $106 trillion. So you talked about, and you related our debt to a family. I'd just kind of like to have you relate why a nation that is in debt over its head, why it's hard to grow their economy when you have this massive debt hanging over their head, massive debt service. And isn't that pretty similar to a family that is in debt over its head, spending all its money on servicing a debt, having the creditors banging on their door? Kind of hard to grow a personal economy as well. Can you just kind of speak to that?
Well, I never want to overdo the comparison between the government and families because clearly they're different, but there are a number of conclusions that you can draw. And one is that you can't borrow indefinitely. You can't borrow beyond your means. You also can't borrow to spend on consumption rather than investment and have that turn out well for you. So when families are borrowing to send a kid to college or for further worker training, that might be a good reason to borrow, whereas borrowing to spend a lot of money on consumption isn't. Same for the government. And if you look at how our government spends money right now, it's the reverse of what I would think it should be if we had a long-term strategy, to your point, which you focused on so much about the long term, where the vast majority, probably above 80% of what we spend is on consumption and very little is on investment. And if you look at the difference between what Simpson-Bowles recommended and what happened, the area that fell short was we didn't reform any of the entitlement programs. Where the squeeze has been on the investment, the discretionary portion of our budget. And that squeeze is going to harm our growth and our economy in the long run, in the medium run.
Dr. Blyth, I heard your testimony talking about we've just got a revenue problem. Does that long-term projected deficit, does that not concern you?
It does concern me, but it concerns me in a very different way. Global financial markets, as measured by bond rates, have no issue with funding the United States, and they simply don't. Currently, but a 30-year shout-out, 2.8% is pretty good. The notion that and the family analogy is at all useful for this, I find very problematic. For example, three variables really matter about debt sustainability. One is positive demographics, right? Are you Italy or are you the U.S.? And the U.S. is positive on this. Are you growing? Yeah, we're the leader of the pack. The IMF is celebrating us. That's kind of awesome. So your GDP is growing as well. And then the third one that matters is the rate of growth in the debt. Now, you were saying that basically we're on an unsustainable track, but if we're the lead performer, I don't see how that can be. That's the assumptions built into the model, actually, that does that. So we're actually in a pretty good place to just grow our way into a solvent situation over the long term. Now, should we restructure the budget? This is legitimate democratic debate. What should we spend on? I am deeply troubled by the fact the United States spends 17.7% of GDP on healthcare. That's nuts. It's not like we're all trying to live forever. There's something very strange going on with this. Twice all the other developed countries. So we have issues, but we don't have the issues that are related to family budgets.
Okay, I appreciate that. Governor Engler, you're talking about basically corporate tax reform. Certainly a number of businesses report their income through individual returns through subchapter S's and LLCs, and then those businesses, that business income is actually taxed at those progressive tax rates, which we do have a progressive tax system. The maximum marginal tax rate is approaching 40, in some instances over 40%, just on a federal basis. Then tack on property tax and state tax and payroll tax. So has the Business Roundtable at all explored potentially doing the same thing with larger corporations? In other words, rather than make employees and consumers pay the tax, because that's really who pays the corporate tax, not the piece of paper that's corporate charter.
Right.
It's a self-inflicted wound. We're the chumps. Has the Business Roundtable explored any options of how you make the owners of the larger corporations basically as pass-through entities and make the owners of the companies pay the corporate tax rather than the piece of paper that's corporate charter?
Well, in '86, Senator, everybody went the other way. They fled from the corporate status and went to that incorporated pass-through status. We think, and we talk in terms of business tax reform. Obviously, we think we could get the corporate rate, 25%. That'd get us to average of the OECD nations. Our effective rates today are, according to a World Bank study that was done, looked at 185 countries. We have the highest effective rate among the G7 nations. There's a lot of confusion about that. You see a lot of different rates tossed around, but we've got a very high effective rate. The 25% rate would, I think, make us globally competitive, and that's where we ought to be. I talk about the states. The states are the way to understand this, I think, and your question's an excellent one, because you look at how the states compete for jobs, and we saw migration from Michigan sure saw it from the Midwest down to the South. When Indiana went to a right-to-work state, that put pressure on your state. Michigan now moved to right-to-work states. They're competing because states have to compete. Well, today, unfortunately, that competition is happening among nations, and almost everybody's got a kind of a national economic strategy to go out and compete except us, and that is fundamentally the difference, and that's why we haven't seen GDP growth above 9%, above 3% in 9 years. So it is growth, and that's why I was citing growth as such a contributor to solving these budget problems, and that's how people go to work, and that's how they raise incomes.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse, followed by Senator Crapo.
One quick question for